What is going on in Justin Trudeau's Canada? Well, this week for starters, we've got Hamas riots in Montreal while Justin Trudeau parties at a Taylor Swift concert, and a small Ontario town was fined for refusing to fly the LGBT flag, and the staff of the city were actually required to do mandatory re-education training. So let's start with the riots. Last week, Justin Trudeau was at a Taylor Swift concert, and Montreal was essentially burning. Many of you probably saw the footage. I was watching some of it unfold live on Twitter. But just to give some context to those clips, here's Tristan Hopper in the National Post. A series of anti-Israel riots in Montreal have attracted international condemnation. I believe it was Justin Trudeau who said Canada is back, and prompted conservative calls for an emergency parliamentary probe. Violent protesters set cars on fire, threw small explosives and other objects at police officers, and set fire to an effigy of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, read a letter penned on Monday by conservative members of the Standing Committee on Public Safety. There is crime, chaos, and anti-Semitism taking over Canada. Just for those of you who haven't seen this, let me give you one small clip of what these riots looked like on the ground. So that just gives you a taste of what was going on in Montreal this weekend. And just for contrast, here's what Trudeau was up to while this was going on. So, although Trudeau, after leaving the Taylor Swift concert where he was videoed dancing at the very front, and I checked into this, by the way, tickets where Trudeau was standing cost close to $30,000 a seat. He did condemn the wave of anti-Semitism, which he's been doing very tepidly over the last year and a half. And I want to make one point here that I think bears mentioning. You guys may remember that over the past close to a decade, Trudeau has constantly talked about the far right, the threat of white supremacy, of Nazis. The Freedom Convoy was accused routinely of being packed with white supremacists and Nazis. There was a weird incident at the very beginning of the Freedom Convoy in which there was one dude with a full mask in the most anti-masking crowd in the country, which I found suspicious, waving what purported to be a Nazi flag. This was discussed endlessly by every single Liberal MP. Now you've actually got people who are chanting real Nazi slogans. There was actually a staff member from the Second Cup franchise at the Montreal Jewish Hospital who threw up a Nazi salute. I'm not going to do that for you on camera in case somebody screenshots it, but you know what salute I'm talking about, and then started talking about a final solution for the Jews. Now, have you noted that incident get called out by any Liberal MPs at all? If you have, please drop in the comments, because I've looked long and hard and I can find nothing. So mysterious, non-existent Nazis are constantly put forward as evidence of Canada's exploding far right. But when you've got people who are actually saying the sorts of things that Nazis actually said, referencing an actual Nazi program to extinguish the Jews, using the actual Nazi salute, we're suddenly getting crickets. Total crickets from the Liberal MPs. And the subdued response to what happened in Montreal and what's been unfolding across the country, compared with the sheer vitriol that they aim at anybody who expresses moderately socially conservative views, is, I think, really indicative of where this government is at. People who hold the same views that the majority of Canadians have held, or the majority of our history, are castigated as un-Canadian, as fundamentally other, as American imports, while people who actually were imported into this country, who have a deep hatred for the Jews, those people get a pass. Those people somehow manage to consistently escape the condemnation of the Prime Minister, who, you'll notice, even when he does tweet against anti-Semitism, declines to mention the groups who are perpetrating the anti-Semitism, which is not something that he is afraid of doing when he's busy smearing large-scale protests that happened to oppose his policies. And here's where Conservative leader Pierre did a really good job. And he said something on X in response to Justin Trudeau's post. In fact, he quoted Justin Trudeau's condemnation of the anti-Semitism, which presumably was tweeted out after he got back from the concert and spoke to all of his overpaid DEI experts. And the reason what he said was so interesting is because he was far blunter than political leaders are usually willing to do. And I'm going to read his post in full. It had over 6 million impressions on X, by the way. "You act surprised. We are reaping what you sowed. This is what happens when a prime minister spends 9 years pushing woke identity politics, dividing and subdividing people by race, gender, vaccine status, religion, region, age, wealth, etc. On top of driving people apart, you systematically break what used to bring us together, saying Canada is a post-national state with no core identity. You erased our veterans and military, the famous five, and even Terry Fox from our passport to replace them with meaningless squirrels, snowflakes, and a drawing of yourself swimming as a boy. You opened the borders to terrorists and lawbreakers and called anyone who questioned it a racist. You send out your MPs to say one thing in a mosque and the opposite in a synagogue, one thing in a mandir and the opposite in a gurdwara. You have made Canada a playground for foreign interference. You allowed Iran's IRGC terrorists to legally operate here for 4 years after they murdered 55 of our citizens in a major unprovoked attack. You passed laws that release rampant offenders from prison within hours of their 80th arrest. And what is the result? Assassination on Canadian soil, firebombings of synagogues, extremist violence against mandirs and gurdwaras. Over 100 churches burned or vandalized with barely any condemnation from you, all for a total 250% more hate crime. And while you were dancing, Montreal was burning. We won't let you divide us anymore. Call an election now. We will fire you and reclaim our citizenship, our values, our lives, our freedom, and most of all, our country." If this was a clip, I'd follow this with the sort of slow clap video because he's bang on here and he covers a lot of territory, mentioning the fact that Canada's churches have been burning. In fact, many historic heritage churches have been burning. The last time a church burned, Justin Trudeau actually declared an attack on Islamophobia. It was Islamophobia Awareness Month or something like that. But Montreal, keep in mind, is home to one of Canada's oldest Jewish communities, and it is now dangerous for Jews. And just in case you don't want to take it from me, because obviously I don't like Trudeau and have plenty of reasons not to like him, maybe you'll take it from Liberal Member of Parliament Anthony Housefather, who is a Jewish parliamentarian and again a member of Trudeau's caucus. And he tweeted this on November 24. "Today, a Montreal rabbi and his family were told to leave a downtown area by police. The issue, he was wearing a kippah, and police were worried he might incite demonstrators walking by yelling chants. I have reached out to the mayor as this absurd policing needs to end now." It's not the policing that's the problem here. The problem is that we've imported people into places like Montreal that make it dangerous for a rabbi to walk down the street wearing traditional Jewish garb. And anybody looking at the situation can recognize what is taking place, can recognize that Trudeau took a very functioning country over from Prime Minister Stephen Harper and pushed almost every aspect of our country to the breaking point, from euthanasia all the way to mass immigration. That is the reality of what's going on right now, which is why a poll this week actually indicated the Liberals at something like 17%, which conceivably means they could face an electoral wipeout very similar to the wipeout faced by Brian Mulroney. Well, it wasn't Brian Mulroney. He handed the party off to Kim Campbell in 1992. And one of the reasons that he lost so badly was he had alienated various sections of the country, but never at any point was he nearly as divisive and hateful as Justin Trudeau is. In Montreal, there was actually twofold riots. One was the anti-NATO, anti-Israel demonstration on Friday that resulted in the smashed windows and the burned cars. The other was a 2-day mass walkout of post-secondary students that saw masked activists blockading university property, forcibly canceling classes, and of course doing what they always do, which is leaving a graffiti and broken windows. There was video from Global News that showed demonstrators, their faces concealed by keffiyehs, which is sort of the Middle Eastern Arab head covering, entering a lecture hall at Concordia University and ringing cowbells until students dispersed. that walkout would yield hundreds of images of demonstrators overwhelming security, so this is violent, and pouring into the lobby of Concordia University. And this also is the protest that featured the woman throwing up her arm in the Nazi salute and calling for a final solution. Again, that woman actually worked as the operator of Montreal's Jewish hospital. And so the coffee chain has now shut down that location entirely. This has gotten noticed by people worldwide, especially on the heels of that pogrom on the streets of Amsterdam several weeks ago. And one video was actually circulated by Israel's Washington, D.C. embassy. And it showed two men actually trying to force their way into the locked doors of a Concordia lecture hall, chanting "Viva Vida Intifada." Now, any of you who know anything about what the second and first intifadas were in Israel, they were campaigns of suicide bombing that took place across Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and elsewhere. And the Université de Montreal campus was similarly splashed with paint. Large green Palestine Libre, or Free Palestine, was written across the central courtyard. And the list goes on. I could waste a whole episode just listing off all of the different ways that these pro-Hamas protesters smashed windows, poured graffiti all over private property, overwhelmed security, and forced their way onto university property, and of course did things like call for a final solution to the Jews. There's another lesson to be taken in all of this, because Justin Trudeau, as Pierre Poilievre pointed out, has been trying to play both sides of this issue. One of the reasons is that he's stuck. It's because his caucus is very divided on this issue. He's got MPs like Anthony Housefather who are appalled by the rise of anti-Semitism in Canada on Trudeau's watch. You also have a lot of radical leftist liberal MPs who are very, very opposed to Israel, hold views that get dangerously close to anti-Semitism, and at the very least have a lot of sympathy for these protesters, even if they don't care for some of the methods these protesters are using. And one of the reasons there are so many of these MPs is because Trudeau pivoted hard to the left in order to outflank the NDP and form essentially a government of Canada's progressives writ large. He wanted the NDP to be irrelevant and for the Liberal Party to occupy Canada's entire left-wing hemisphere, which he has successfully done. But now he finds himself trapped between liberal principles and leftist principles. And keep in mind here now that Justin Trudeau is basically given every concession he possibly can to Canada's Muslim community. He has almost never condemned the protests specifically. He gives very tepid responses to very vile chants. He has been remarkably circumspect in how he condemns anti-Semitism, which includes shots being taken at Jewish elementary schools in this country, which you think would be a bigger story than it is, but just really doesn't seem to be that big of a deal. At the same time, he talks almost constantly about Islamophobia as if that's the greatest threat facing Canadians today, and refuses to recognize the fact that what we're seeing right now is just wanton looting, violence, and disorder being perpetrated primarily by Jew-hating anti-Semites. That is the reality of what's going on. This is why Justin Trudeau refused to say that he would not permit Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu from being arrested on Canadian soil after the International Court in The Hague actually issued a warrant for his arrest alongside another Israeli leader and some Hamas militants, essentially stating that there's some sort of equivalence between those who perpetrated the October 7 attacks and those who are responding to them. So there is no moral direction in this government. Instead, we see total moral bankruptcy. And I get that some people are going to say, look, Justin Trudeau was just, being a dad, and he was partying at a Taylor Swift concert with his daughter. I don't know if ordinary dads can afford the something like $60,000 price tag that would have cost. But that aside, there's just something very fitting about Justin Trudeau dancing to teeny bopper songs with a pop star, while really serious things are going on in the city, by the way, that he claims to represent, Montreal. There's just something very fitting about that microscopic image of Justin Trudeau flailing around with the Swifties. And then, of course, Jews having to hide in their homes because Hamas protesters are smashing windows, burning cars, and overwhelming security at his universities. Because the reality is that a lot of the decisions made by elite lawmakers those decisions are not decisions they have to live with. They live in gated communities. They're wealthy enough to escape the consequences of many of their own policies, but the average Canadian is pretty fed up with this. And I really hope that Justin Trudeau sticks around and remains Prime Minister, because I think Canadians deserve the opportunity to actually give him the sort of devastating electoral blow that might even have the capacity to puncture his seemingly airtight hubris. We'll have to see. In Canada, the LGBT movement uses pride flags to bully small towns and small communities across the country. And a great example of this, unfortunately, is an article released on the CBC, that's Canada's national broadcaster, for those of you fortunate enough never to have encountered it, on November 22. The headline says it all, and I'm actually going to read through this article because it is really a masterclass in propaganda. The title is Ontario Human Rights Tribunal Fines Emo Township for Refusing Pride Proclamation. Here's what the article says. The Ontario Human Rights Tribunal, this is sort of a pseudo-judicial kangaroo court that has given far too much power, has found the Township of Emo will have to pay damages after refusing to proclaim Pride Month back in 2020. Borderland Pride, I do like the name, requested Emo to declare June as a Pride Month and display a rainbow flag for 1 week, but the township refused, resulting in a years-long process in which the tribunal ruled against the township. So keep in mind here that this means LGBT activists are suing a town because that town refuses to use public property to declare allegiance to their particular ideology. That's what's going on here, because LGBT activists, by the way, think they own your public spaces, and colonizers always use flags to symbolize their dominance over territory. And the LGBT movement in Trudeau's Canada now more or less owns the country. That's why we have a 4-month Pride season in Trudeau's Canada. And so now what they're saying is we have the right to raise our flag here, and if you do not, we're going to sue you. And that lawsuit has worked. The tribunal ruled Borderland Pride will be awarded $15,000, with $10,000 coming from the township itself, and another $5,000, get this, coming from Emo Mayor, that didn't sound great, but Emo is the township, Emo Mayor Harold McQuaker. So Harold McQuaker's got to pay $5,000 to the LGBT activists because he refuses to raise a flag symbolizing his allegiance to their ideology, which, by the way, is an ideology that includes furries and half-naked men scampering around downtown in Canada's largest cities every June, and includes unfettered support for sex changes for minors, just to give you an idea of what this flag means in 2024. Doug Johnson is a lawyer in Fort Francis and one of the directors on the board of Borderland Pride, and said they're elated to have finally brought it to a close, and it is a significant victory for the organization. And there's a picture of him here on the CBC looking precisely as you'd expect somebody like him to look. We didn't pursue this because of the money. We pursued this because we were treated in a discriminatory fashion by a municipal government, and municipalities have obligations under the Ontario Human Rights Code not to discriminate in the provision of a service, said Judson cluelessly. The tribunal's decision affirms that. That is the important thing we were seeking here, was validation that the 2S LGBTQA plus people, I never know what the plus stands for, and I'm not looking forward to finding out, we're entitled to a treatment without discrimination when we try to seek services from our local government. I don't know what he means by services, but flying a flag that affirms all of these identities and whatever the plus people are is not a service. In addition to the compensation, the tribunal also ordered McQuaker and the chief administrative officer of the municipality to complete a Human Rights 101 training course offered by the Ontario Human Rights Commission within 30 days. So they all had to go to re-education camp to find out why the LGBT and the plus people were actually deserving of having a flag fly over a town inhabited by people who are not part of the alphabet mafia. Judson said one of the messages it sends to other townships and municipalities is that pride needs to be in the smallest and remote communities, just as it is in larger cities, and in some of the places where it can be really hard to help people understand why it's so important. So in other words, we want to fly our flag in your town so you realize that we own this place too. It's a nice little town you have there. It would be a shame if something happened to it. We see this happening at towns right across the country. I hope that it emboldens and strengthens people in communities like Emo and other places like that across Ontario to know they have entitlements from their government, said Judson. He is really insufferable. Going forward, Judson said he would like to see the relationship between Borderland Pride, which is kind of like a forced coercive marriage, and the Township of Emo be more positive after re-education is complete, with the municipality being a more active supporter of their programming. Otherwise, he'll probably go back to court. Having a place like Emo as part of Pride and having leadership figures take part in Pride, it lends a lot of support to the movement, whether you like it or not. It validates and legitimizes that the message is important for the entire community, so we hope that is the case moving forward. CBC News reached out to the mayor of Emo for comment, but did not receive a response. He was probably boning up on Human Rights 101 and discovering that this means he now has to support the plus people, as well as sex changes for kids, and also those weird drag queens who show up in downtown Toronto with their derriere hanging out in public. And if you don't believe me, Google Toronto Pride, hit Google Images, and make sure your kids aren't in the room, because I'm not exaggerating. So this is really extraordinary because it's a microcosm again of what's going on across the country. We've seen this in multiple small towns all the way across. Generally speaking, big cities have had pride parades, but small towns don't. And so what Pride has been doing is they've been setting up these small pride organizations in little towns, and they've been trying to force pride parades into these towns for the sheer purpose of normalizing and mainstreaming their worldview. And they're doing it especially where they know the majority of people don't agree with them, because they want to rub people's faces in it. That's why you've got to have, a pride sidewalk in every single small town. And if there ends up being rubber on the sidewalk because, cars drive over them and there is rubber on tires, this can be declared a hate crime and suddenly they're victims. And so most Canadian institutions at the national level always are competing to see who can grovel lowest and flag wave the hardest. And politicians generally arrive to genuflect to their cultural overlords, and corporations send big expensive floats to these festivals of nudity and indecency, and the LGBT flag is hoisted everywhere. My local grocery store still has giant progress flags pasted to the automatic sliding glass doors, and I'm pretty sure Pride season ended several months ago, although it may be longer now. So who knows? Maybe November now is also part of Pride season, because pretty soon they're going to own the whole calendar. So here's how this grift works, because what LGBT activists do is they move into somewhere and they insist that everybody fly the LGBT flag to overtly announce support for their ideology. And what happens next is some institutions decline to fly this flag for reasons ranging from just religious disagreement in general, or community unity. Communities are made up of all kinds of different groups, and generally speaking, most communities only want to fly flags that everybody can agree with. So you've seen a number of bylaws passed in Alberta and Ontario where cities said we're actually going to limit the flags on civic flagpoles to the township, the province, or the country, because these are flags that unify everyone from a conservative Christian to an LGBT activist. But then what happens is point 3. LGBT activists characterize this refusal to proactively show support for their agenda as a backlash, and then the Canadian media obediently characterizes it as such. LGBT activists now, of course, are the victims or the targets because of their own targets' refusal to participate in the narrative that they themselves have created. And it's really sickening to watch this take place. We actually saw this in the small town of Norwich, Ontario, some years ago, where the town council voted to limit the flags flown on civic flagpoles to federal, provincial, or township flags. The LGBT activists, they hosted these major protests. They attempted to take over city council. That didn't work. And then they actually had topless activists protesting outside a church all summer. So first it was 1, then it ended up being around 3. Women, again, they were completely topless in front of church where thousands of people were driving past every Sunday morning. And they were essentially weaponizing nudity and aiming it at families with small children. But of course, this is just portrayed as, a civil rights protest on behalf of the LGBT movement, not weaponizing nudity and aiming it at kids, which it very explicitly is, which is in keeping with the way the LGBT movement functions. But let me give you a quote just to show you how this works. Tammy Murray, the president of Oxford County Pride, stated that, "I think our safety is at risk in Norwich and Ontario." And I think that was demonstrated last evening when they passed the flagpole ban, not just by banning pride flags, but they also did not endorse the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, and they also refused to proclaim Pride Month. All of the above is very concerning in terms of their understanding of oppression and marginalization. This is actually a joke. And it's very easy to see how the game is played. Again, Let me just lay this out for people, because there's a lot of people who are like, well, how did we get here? How did we go from being like in a small rural town and suddenly we've got a pride crosswalk, and if somebody squeals their tires going around a corner, this is immediately a hate crime, because apparently LGBT activists aren't aware that people drive across sidewalks and across crosswalks, pardon me. And that when they do so, sometimes you get black marks on the road, which you usually can't see because it's black asphalt, but you can see it on a bright rainbow crosswalk because it's really, really obvious and, kind of gauche and irritating. But so sometimes it shows up there, and this is not a hate crime. It's what happens when people drive on the road. So this might be helpful information to those who feel persecuted but don't actually need to, so they can hug this information to themselves and recognize that nobody actually cares at all. But the reality is that the reason they're doing this in these small towns is because they create the whole narrative ahead of time. Hey, do this. The person's like, I'm not going to do that. He's like, I can't believe the backlash to my very honest and innocent request. And so by you saying no to a demand, you are creating a backlash. They then immediately call the CBC and Global and City News. When this went down in Norwich, Ontario, there was over 40 mainstream media articles that portrayed the LGBT communities as victims. Victims of what? Victims of not having a whole month declared, just to talk about them and to talk about how great they are and how we agree with all of their behavior, because apparently in Trudeau's Canada in 2024, it's now mandatory to pretend that we agree with these people. Or if you're unfortunate enough to be in Emo Township, you have to personally pay them money because you wouldn't fly their flag, and then personally get re-educated. This is one of the reasons you're starting to see a backlash to the LGBT movement in general. And one of the reasons you're starting to see this backlash is because people are just sick of it. They're sick of being told that this is actually no longer about living and let live. This is no longer about tolerance. It's about you need to proactively genuflect to a specific ideology, or you get accused of being hateful, you get accused of being discriminatory, you get told that you need re-education. And so we're finally starting to see a few conservative politicians come out and say what they should have been saying for many years. So John Rustad in BC, for example, I think I pronounced his name right. Anyways, he's the leader of the Conservative Party that made a very good showing in the last provincial election. He responded to a tweet from J.K. Rowling. J.K. Rowling, of course, has been on fire in her condemnations of gender ideology. But he quoted one of her tweets and said, "In British Columbia, grown men should not be allowed to shower with 10-year-old girls in the change room of a local public pool. This should not be a controversial statement. Frankly, it's unsettling that people are defending this creepy behavior." So one, amen to that. I'm glad John Rustad had the courage to say this. But I do want to make one point here. If you want to have any idea of why this got so far, it's because it took conservatives 10 years to get the testicular fortitude to say this sort of thing in public. I have been saying this for a very long time, so have other activists, and while you have politicians, just like John Rustad, guys like him, right, just sort of middle-of-the-road conservatives who kind of release a statement for Pride Month most of the time, assure everybody they're on board with everything. They stayed silent while all of these changes were made to our culture and to our country. They kept their mouths shut while the transgender movement rolled through all of our institutions. They didn't say a word when conservative MPs and conservative legislators in the provinces started showing up at Pride events. And then so when they finally realized, oh wow, they want us to castrate kids, we should probably say something now. Now it looks like it takes courage. But for years, while I've been watching candidates on the provincial and the federal level get disqualified or kicked out of nominations for saying exactly what John Rustad just said here. There was people who got disqualified in the last election in BC who were running because they said things like this, because they said Pride is gross and people are showing their genitals to kids at Pride, and that's wrong, right? That is, as John Rustad says here now, should not be a controversial statement. Well, it was controversial enough to have people get kicked out of the Conservative Party of British Columbia last time around. So I'm really glad he's saying this, and I don't want to undermine how good it is that he's willing to say this out loud. But if conservatives are going to look at the mayor of Emo having to get re-education and pay $5,000 to the Pride activists, and if you're looking at small towns getting bullied into raising Pride flags, and you're wondering how we got to a place where it's more controversial not to fly the trans flag over a Catholic school in Ontario than it is to fly one, I think conservatives need to take a good, long, hard look in the mirror and realize that they've been appeasing these people for far too long. And as Winston Churchill said, appeasement is the art of feeding a hungry crocodile and hoping he eats you last. And now they've been finally backed into a corner and realized this stuff is insane and we should start to say something about it. Yeah, better late than never. But I do want everybody to recognize that at the end of the day, if people like John Rustad were saying exactly what he just said on November 24, if they were saying this 10 years ago, we wouldn't be where we are now. So let's not make the same mistakes going forward. Thanks everybody for tuning into this episode of the Bridgehead Briefing. My name is Jonathon Van Maren, and we really appreciate you tuning into the show. If you have any comments on any of the commentary, please drop them in the comment section. If you have suggested topics you'd like to see us cover, again, make those suggestions below. If you found the video helpful, do like it and share it around, because we're trying to build an audience, especially for Canadian socially conservative content. You can also find our podcast wherever you get your content, or you can head over to thebridgehead.ca, where we have written commentary, and you can get copies of all of our books, including my new book, which you can see right behind me there. Thanks so much.